Ladies and gentlemen, today we confront a story that echoes the struggles of justice, accountability, and the power of the unexpected. Imagine this. A black woman is pulled over by a cop. His tone is harsh, his actions are aggressive, and his intent is clear. He's not here to serve and protect. He's here to intimidate. But what he doesn't know is that this woman isn't just anyone. She isn't just another target for his abuse of power. She has backup, and not the kind he expects. You see, racial profiling isn't just a misunderstanding, it's a systemic disease. Black men and women across this nation know the routine all too well. The nervous glances, the unnecessary stops, the hands that shake while reaching for an ID, fearing that compliance won't be enough. And in this case, that fear was justified. This officer thought he could get away with it. Harassment, threats, maybe worse. But here's where the story shifts. Because this black woman, the one he saw as weak, as powerless, as an easy target, she wasn't alone. Her hidden role, her position, her influence was about to turn the tables in a way he never saw coming. Maybe she was a high-ranking lawyer. Maybe she was an off-duty officer. Maybe she was a civil rights leader, a judge, a state official. Or maybe she was someone who knew her rights and had the courage to fight back. And when the truth came out, when the evidence was exposed, when his abuse of power was no longer just another story swept under the rug, his career didn't just take a hit. It ended. This isn't just one story. This is a reminder. A reminder that power unchecked is power abused. That injustice thrives in silence, but it crumbles under the weight of truth. That those who think they can weaponize authority against black lives will always face a reckoning. Because we stand together, we fight together, and we expose the truth together. So let this be a message. To those who misuse the badge, to those who think racism can go unchecked, to those who believe their authority is absolute, justice will find you. Because the people you target, they have backup. And that backup is stronger than hate, louder than fear, and more powerful than any badge used as a weapon. Thank you. Racial profiling is deeply rooted in the fabric of society, shaping encounters between law enforcement and black individuals in ways that are often unjust, aggressive, and deeply damaging. It is a practice that is not just about individual prejudice but about a system that has long enabled and reinforced racial bias through policies, training, and a culture of impunity. Black individuals have faced the consequences of these biases for generations, from the days of slave patrols to the modern policing era, where the presumption of guilt often overrides fundamental human rights. In the case of this black woman, the moment she was pulled over, she knew the situation was more than just a routine traffic stop. The officer's demeanor was cold, his gaze sharp with an unspoken authority that carried the weight of countless past abuses. He didn't see her as a citizen deserving of respect but as a target, another black individual to be controlled, questioned, and intimidated. She had seen this before, heard the stories, and prepared herself mentally for the ordeal that was about to unfold. The officer's actions were deliberate, fueled by the confidence that his badge gave him the power to act without consequence. He approached the vehicle with a purpose, not to ensure safety, but to impose control. The questions he asked were laced with suspicion, his tone already assuming guilt before any justification was needed. She remained calm, but she knew that compliance did not always guarantee safety. The history of racial profiling had proven that even the most respectful and law-abiding black individuals could still end up as victims of police violence. The officer demanded her identification with an unnecessary sharpness, making it clear that this stop wasn't about a minor violation but about something deeper. It was about asserting dominance, about reinforcing an age-old narrative that black individuals must constantly prove their innocence. As she reached for her identification, she moved carefully, aware that any sudden motion could be misinterpreted, that any sign of frustration could be used against her. This was the reality of being black in America, where even the most mundane interactions with law enforcement could turn into life-threatening situations. As she handed over her ID, the officer scrutinized it, searching for a reason to escalate. He asked more questions, probing, looking for a crack, a reason to justify his already made decision to harass her further. She answered firmly but politely, knowing that any resistance could be twisted into justification for force. Yet, in the back of her mind, she knew something that he didn't. She wasn't just another random driver on the road. She wasn't powerless. She had backup, and that backup was something he had never anticipated. Perhaps she was a high-ranking official in law enforcement, someone who understood the system from the inside. Maybe she was a civil rights attorney who had spent years fighting cases of racial injustice. Or maybe she had connections, people who were watching, waiting for the moment to step in. Regardless of her exact role, she held a power that was invisible to the officer, a power that would soon turn this situation in a direction he never expected. The officer continued his attempt to intimidate, pressing her for more information, trying to catch her in something, anything, that could be used as a pretext for escalation. But she remained composed, her responses measured, her awareness of the situation evident. She knew the law, knew her rights, and most importantly, knew how to handle men like him. Then came the turning point. The officer made a move, perhaps reaching for his cuffs, perhaps calling for unnecessary backup, thinking he was about to assert ultimate control over the situation. But before he could go any further, something shifted. Maybe she made a phone call, maybe she revealed something in her response, or maybe an unexpected observer arrived. Suddenly, the officer's confidence wavered. His expression shifted from arrogance to uncertainty, his actions slowed as doubt crept into his mind. In that moment, he realized he had made a mistake. The woman he had targeted wasn't just another victim of racial profiling, she was someone with the ability to fight back in a way that could end his career. She wasn't alone. She had the knowledge, the influence, and the connections to ensure that this encounter wouldn't be another silent injustice. The backup she had, whether it was legal authority, professional standing, or simply undeniable evidence, was enough to turn the tables completely. The officer, who moments ago had been so sure of his control, now found himself exposed. His actions, once shielded by the false comfort that his badge gave him immunity, were now under scrutiny. His behavior had consequences, and this time, those consequences wouldn't just be brushed aside. What followed was the unraveling of a career built on abuse of power. Whether through internal investigations, legal action, or public exposure, the truth came to light. His pattern of behavior was examined, and what had once been dismissed as isolated incidents now formed a clear picture of racial bias and misconduct. The system that had long protected officers like him found itself unable to shield him from the weight of undeniable evidence. The woman's role in this wasn't just about saving herself from an unjust encounter. It was about making a statement. About showing that racial profiling doesn't always end with silence, that those who abuse their power can and will be held accountable. It was a moment of justice, a moment that sent a message far beyond this single incident. Yet, this wasn't just about one officer or one woman. This was about a system that had allowed moments like this to happen over and over again. It was about the countless stories that didn't have a fortunate outcome, the names we remember, the lives lost to unchecked police aggression. The problem of racial profiling isn't just about individuals, it's about policies that enable it, about leadership that refuses to acknowledge it, about a culture that prioritizes power over humanity. For every case like this one, where justice was served, there are many more where victims don't get the chance to fight back. Some don't survive the encounter, others are buried under legal battles that favor the system, and many simply go unheard, their stories fading into statistics. The fight against racial profiling isn't just about punishing bad officers, it's about dismantling the structures that allow them to exist in the first place. The reality is that policing in America has long been shaped by racial bias, from the way communities are patrolled to the way laws are enforced. Black individuals are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, more likely to be arrested, and more likely to face violence at the hands of law enforcement. These disparities aren't accidental. They are the result of policies and attitudes that have gone unchallenged for too long. Even with body cameras, even with protests, even with awareness campaigns, racial profiling persists because it is ingrained in the way law enforcement operates. The idea that blackness is a threat is so deeply embedded in the system that even well-meaning officers often act on subconscious biases. And for those who intentionally wield their authority as a weapon, the consequences have historically been minimal. But the tide is shifting. The ability to expose injustice has never been greater. The power of individuals to hold officers accountable, to record interactions, to challenge false narratives, and to demand change is stronger than ever. The more these stories come to light, the harder it becomes for the system to ignore them. The case of this black woman wasn't just about one victory. It was a reminder that racial profiling is a fight that must be confronted every day. It was proof that knowledge, preparation, and the right support can challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. And it was a testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed, can still be served when those who are targeted refuse to back down. The night was supposed to be like any other. The black woman had just finished a long day at work, her mind occupied with thoughts of home, relaxation, and the simple comfort of unwinding after hours of responsibilities. As she drove through the dimly lit streets, she followed every traffic rule meticulously, just as she always did. Experience had taught her that being black behind the wheel meant extra caution was necessary. She had seen too many stories, had too many conversations about encounters that went wrong, and knew that even a minor infraction could escalate in ways that white drivers rarely had to worry about. The glow of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror sent a familiar wave of anxiety through her. Her stomach tightened, her hands gripped the steering wheel a little harder, and her heartbeat quickened. There was no reason she should have been stopped. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a light, hadn't even switched lanes without signaling. Yet, here she was, another black person pulled over without justification. She let out a slow breath and quickly ran through everything she knew to do in these situations. She rolled down her window, placed both hands visibly on the wheel, and made sure her driver's license and registration were within reach. Any sudden movement, any perceived hesitation, could be interpreted as a threat. The officer approached the car with a slow, deliberate stride, his flashlight shining directly into her face. She squinted slightly, resisting the urge to look away, knowing that even avoiding eye contact could be twisted into an accusation of suspicious behavior. The first words out of his mouth weren't a polite greeting or an explanation for the stop, but a sharp demand. License and registration. She swallowed her frustration. No explanation, no courtesy, just immediate authority. This wasn't about public safety, this was about control. Still, she kept her voice steady and calm. Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over? His lips curled slightly, as if he was already irritated by the question. License and registration, he repeated, his voice sharper. She knew better than to argue. Slowly, she reached for the documents, careful to move deliberately, narrating each step. I'm reaching for my license now. Even as she complied, she could feel his eyes on her, assessing, searching for something, anything, that could justify whatever next step he wanted to take. She handed over the documents, and he snatched them away, barely glancing at them before shining his flashlight into the backseat of her car. Where are you headed? She hesitated for half a second. Did she have to answer that? Legally, no, but refusing could make things worse. I'm on my way home, she said simply. Where's home? Her jaw clenched slightly. There was no reason for this line of questioning. She hadn't committed a crime. This wasn't a checkpoint. He wasn't investigating anything. He was fishing, looking for an excuse to escalate the situation. I live nearby, she answered, keeping her voice measured. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his posture, in the way he stood just a little too close to her car, in the way his hand hovered near his holster, that made it clear he was looking for trouble. Step out of the vehicle. Her stomach dropped. There was no reason for this. None. Officer, may I ask why? Step out of the car, he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. She had a choice to make. Stay inside and risk him claiming she was resisting. Or step out and risk being further harassed, maybe even assaulted. She moved carefully, her mind racing. She had done nothing wrong. This was wrong. He knew it, she knew it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had the badge, the gun, and the authority to turn this into something much worse. As soon as she was out of the car, he moved in closer. Too close. You got anything on you I should know about? No, she said firmly. He didn't believe her. She could see it in his smirk. He wanted to search her car. I'm going to check, he said, already moving toward the driver's side. You don't have probable cause, she said quickly, her voice carrying more strength now. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't expected pushback. What did you say? She took a slow breath. You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle. For a second, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Then, his smirk returned. Are you a lawyer or something? He asked, mockingly. She didn't answer. Turn around, he ordered. She froze. What? Turn around. Hands. Behind your back. This was it. He was arresting her. For what? For daring to challenge him. For knowing her rights. For not being afraid enough. Her mind raced through every possible action. Should she comply and hope she could fight this in court? Should she demand a supervisor? Should she call someone? And then, she remembered. He had no idea who she was. She slowly turned around but not in surrender. She was reaching for her phone. I suggest you reconsider what you're about to do, she said, her voice eerily calm. The confidence in her tone caught him off guard. You do not have the legal right to detain me without cause, and if you attempt to do so, you will regret it. The shift in power was immediate. He wasn't used to this. He was used to people fearing him, obeying without question. He wasn't used to someone standing firm, especially not a black woman who he had assumed was powerless. And then, she made the call. It was quick, efficient, and chillingly effective. Hello, Chief. I need you to send someone over immediately. I'm being unlawfully detained. The officer stiffened. His face drained of color. Chief. His mind raced. Who was she? She turned to look at him now, for the first time holding the kind of authority he had tried to impose over her. Would you like to explain to my colleagues why you decided to stop me tonight? Silence. He was unraveling, his confidence crumbling. He had been so sure this would be just another routine power play, another case of racial profiling that wouldn't be challenged. But he had made a mistake, a critical one. He had picked the wrong person. Minutes later, a second patrol car arrived. Then another. Supervisors stepped out, faces grim as they assessed the scene. The tables had completely turned. The officer, once so full of arrogance, was now fumbling over his words, trying to justify his actions. But there was no justification. A formal complaint was filed. An investigation was launched. And soon, the full extent of his misconduct came to light. He had done this before. Too many times. But this time, it had cost him everything. And the black woman who had been wrongly targeted. She had made sure he would never do it again. The air was thick with tension as the black woman stood beside her car, her mind racing to process what was happening. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, once again, facing the sharp end of racial profiling. The police officer towering over her carried himself with the smug confidence of someone who believed he held absolute power. He had no idea who she was, no clue that the woman he had decided to harass was far from helpless. It had started with flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the telltale sign of a traffic stop that she knew wasn't justified. She had been careful, more careful than most people had to be. She followed every rule, signaled every turn, stayed within the speed limit. Yet, none of that mattered when you were black behind the wheel. The moment she saw those lights, her body tensed, her heartbeat quickened, and a familiar sense of dread settled over her. The officer approached her window with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who enjoyed exerting control. He shined his flashlight directly into her face, as if trying to blind her, to disorient her. License and registration, he barked. No explanation, no greeting, no reason for the stop. Just an immediate demand. She kept her voice steady. Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over? The question irritated him. His jaw tightened, and his grip on his flashlight shifted slightly. License and registration, he repeated, sharper this time. She had learned over the years that there were moments to argue and moments to comply. Right now, pushing back too hard could escalate the situation into something worse. Slowly, she retrieved her documents, narrating every movement as she did so. I'm reaching for my license now. His eyes flickered with something. Annoyance, impatience, maybe even amusement. He took the documents without a word and barely glanced at them before shifting his flashlight to the backseat of her car. Where are you headed? She knew she didn't have to answer that. But refusing would only make him more aggressive. I'm on my way home. Where's home? She clenched her jaw slightly. There was no reason for him to ask. This wasn't a routine stop. It was a fishing expedition. Nearby, she answered, keeping her tone neutral. The officer exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers against the side of her car. Step out of the vehicle. Her stomach dropped. There was no reason for this. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't swerved. She hadn't broken a single law. Officer. Why? Step out of the car. His tone left no room for negotiation. He wasn't asking. He was daring her to resist. She took a slow breath and moved carefully, making sure to keep her hands visible at all times. She could feel his eyes scanning her, looking for anything to justify what he already wanted to do. You got any weapons on you? No. Anything illegal in the car? No. He smirked. Mind if I take a look? She knew her rights. She had every legal ground to refuse. Yes, I do mind, she said firmly. You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle. For a moment, he seemed taken aback. He hadn't expected her to push back, to know the law. Turn around, he said suddenly. She froze. What? Turn around. Hands behind your back. He was arresting her. For what? She was being detained for no reason other than the fact that this officer had decided he could. That was it. His power, his authority, his bias, that was all the justification he needed. And then, she remembered. He had no idea who she was. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips, though she kept her expression calm. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked, her voice eerily composed. The officer's smirk faltered just slightly. Excuse me. She turned her head to look at him, meeting his gaze with a quiet confidence. I said, are you sure you want to do this? There was something in the way she said it, something that made him hesitate for the first time. Then she reached for her phone. I'd like to make a call, she said simply. He scoffed. You think calling someone is gonna change what's happening here? She dialed. The line rang once, twice, and then, a voice answered. Ma'am. The voice said on the other end, firm, professional. Is there an issue? She met the officer's gaze as she spoke into the phone. Yes. I'm currently being unlawfully detained by an officer who refuses to give me a valid reason for this stop. The officer's face changed. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. The voice on the other end of the call continued, this time louder, clearer. Put me on speaker. The woman obeyed, her thumb pressing the button before holding the phone up. This is Chief Daniels of the Internal Affairs Division, the voice said, filling the silence between them. Officer, identify yourself immediately. The color drained from the cop's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I wasn't. You weren't what? The chief's voice cut in, sharp as a blade. Explain to me why this woman is being detained. The officer floundered. His earlier confidence was gone. I was just conducting a routine stop. No, you weren't. The chief's voice left no room for argument. I need your badge number. Right now. The officer swallowed hard. The tables had turned. He muttered the numbers under his breath. Louder. He repeated them, voice shaking now. The black woman, still standing tall, crossed her arms over her chest. She could feel the power shifting back into her hands. The chief continued. I want you to release this woman immediately and remain at the scene. A supervisor is on the way. Silence. The officer clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He looked like a man whose world was crumbling around him. She smiled. You had no idea, did you? She asked, tilting her head slightly. The officer didn't respond. The truth was, she wasn't just any woman. She worked within the system. She was a civil rights attorney, a legal advocate, and, most importantly, someone with direct ties to those who could end this officer's career with a single phone call. The supervisor arrived minutes later. More officers followed. The scene was no longer his to control. The racist cop, once so full of arrogance, now stood frozen in place as he was questioned. And the black woman. She got back into her car, safe, unharmed, but not unchanged. She had faced what too many black men and women faced daily. But unlike many, she had backup, an unexpected, powerful backup. And because of that, this officer's career was about to come to an abrupt and well-deserved end. The officer stood tall, exuding the kind of authority that came with years of unchecked power. His uniform, his badge, the gun at his hip, these were symbols of his control, tools he had wielded countless times without consequence. He had done this before, stopped black drivers without cause, intimidated them, made them feel powerless. And each time, he had walked away without so much as a slap on the wrist. But tonight, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The black woman in front of him was not like the others he had targeted. She did not shrink under his gaze, did not stumble over her words or panic in the way he expected. Instead, there was something in her eyes, something sharp, something knowing. It unsettled him, though he wouldn't dare show it. He assumed she was just another easy target, another person he could toy with, another individual who would comply out of fear. He had built his career on assumptions like these, never once questioning whether he had miscalculated. Until now, she moved with deliberate precision, each action careful and controlled, as though she were waiting for him to make a critical mistake. When she reached for her license and registration, she narrated every movement, ensuring there would be no excuse for him to escalate the situation. "I'm reaching for my wallet now," she said. Her voice was steady. It wasn't the tone of someone afraid. It was the voice of someone who knew the game better than he did. The cop narrowed his eyes. He was used to fear, to submission, to drivers stumbling over themselves to prove they weren't a threat. But this woman, she was different. He glanced at the documents she handed him but barely registered the details. He wasn't stopping her for any real reason, just another traffic stop designed to exert control. "A power move. Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. The woman's eyes locked onto his, searching, assessing. "For what reason, officer?" Her calmness annoyed him. He was used to people obeying, not questioning. "Step out of the car." She exhaled slowly, then unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The moment her feet touched the pavement, he knew something was off. She wasn't nervous, wasn't fidgeting or looking around for an escape. She was studying him just as intently as he had been studying her. He had no idea who she really was. As he prepared to pat her down, she spoke again. "Are you sure you want to do this?" He hesitated for the first time. Her voice wasn't just confident, it carried a weight that he couldn't quite place. There was no pleading, no anger, just a certainty that made his stomach tighten. "Turn around," he barked, trying to regain control. She didn't. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I'd like to make a call," she said. The cop smirked. "Go ahead. That won't change anything." But the moment she dialed, everything did change. The voice on the other end answered after one ring. Yes. There was no casual greeting, no confusion. Whoever was on the other end knew exactly who she was and why she was calling. "Put me on speaker," the voice instructed. The woman did as she was told, holding up the phone so the officer could hear. "This is Attorney General Lewis," the voice announced. "Who am I speaking to?" The cop's blood ran cold. Attorney General. His arrogance cracked, just slightly. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how badly this was about to go for him. This is Officer. I already know who you are," the voice interrupted. "What I want to know is why you've pulled over my colleague and are now attempting to detain her without probable cause." Colleague. The woman standing before him wasn't just a random driver. She wasn't just another person he could intimidate. She was connected to someone with the power to dismantle his entire career in a matter of minutes. The cop opened his mouth, but no words came out. The woman tilted her head, watching as the realization dawned on him. I was just conducting a routine stop," he finally managed to say. "As that's so." The Attorney General's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. "Because I have every reason to believe this is a case of racial profiling. And if that's true, I assure you, this will not end well for you." The officer swallowed hard. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to be just another victim. Another black driver caught in a system designed to break them down. But she wasn't. And she wasn't alone. The Attorney General continued. "You will release her immediately, and you will remain where you are. A representative from Internal Affairs will be arriving shortly to discuss your conduct." The cop's pulse pounded in his ears. This was spiraling out of his control. He had underestimated her power, her influence. And now, he was paying for it. The woman crossed her arms, watching the panic flicker across his face. This was justice. This was accountability. And for the first time in his career, he was the one with no power at all. The night had started like any other for Officer Daniels. He had patrolled these streets countless times, stopping drivers at his discretion, choosing who to question, who to intimidate, who to let go. His badge gave him authority, but more than that, it gave him confidence, confidence that no one would challenge him, that no one would question his motives. After all, he had been doing this for years without consequence. But tonight, things were different. The black woman he pulled over was not like the others. She was calm, too calm. She didn't fumble for excuses or shrink under his glare. Instead, she moved with precision, answering his questions with a measured tone, making no unnecessary movements. It was unsettling. He was used to control, to compliance, to watching fear take hold. But there was no fear in her eyes. Still, he pushed forward, following his usual routine. Accuse, intimidate, demand. He told her to step out of the car, and when she questioned his reasoning, his authority flared up. She was supposed to obey. She was supposed to know her place. But when she pulled out her phone and made that call, everything changed. The voice on the other end was one of power, one that he recognized almost immediately. Attorney General Lewis. The name alone sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't dealing with just anyone. This woman was connected, and not just in a small way. She was an integral part of the legal system, someone with influence, someone who had the means to make his life very difficult. He had thought this was just another routine stop, another opportunity to assert his authority. He was wrong. The moment the Attorney General spoke, the situation shifted. The power he thought he had vanished in an instant. The woman he had pulled over wasn't just another civilian. She was someone who had the ability to bring his actions to light. She wasn't just a target. She was a force. And she wasn't going to let this go. As the minutes stretched on, the realization settled in. Internal Affairs was notified, and officers were en route to the scene. The smugness that had once lined his face was gone, replaced with unease. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of the mess he had created. But there was no easy escape this time. The exposure of truth had begun. And the downfall that followed was inevitable. Word spread quickly. By the time Internal Affairs arrived, reporters had already caught wind of the situation. Social media was flooded with videos taken by bystanders, capturing every moment of the encounter. The woman had been smart. She had started recording the second he approached her vehicle, ensuring that no detail would be lost. Officer Daniels had spent years relying on the shadows, on secrecy, on a system that allowed officers like him to get away with misconduct. But now, the light was being shined directly on him. The footage showed everything. The unnecessary stop, the lack of probable cause, the way he had escalated the situation without justification. The world was watching, and there was no denying what had happened. The department tried to contain the damage, issuing a generic statement about reviewing the incident, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. Civil rights groups got involved, pushing for an investigation. The Attorney General's office publicly condemned his actions, making it clear that this case would not be ignored. The pressure mounted, and soon, the department had no choice but to act. An official inquiry was launched. Officer Daniels was placed on administrative leave, but the outrage only grew. People wanted accountability. They wanted justice. The woman at the center of it all refused to let this become just another forgotten case. She used her platform, her connections, her voice. She wasn't just seeking justice for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wrongly targeted, harassed, or abused by the system. And the deeper the investigation went, the worse things got for Officer Daniels. His past actions were scrutinized. Complaints that had once been ignored were brought back to the surface. Patterns of racial profiling, excessive force, and abuse of power became impossible to deny. He wasn't just a bad cop who made a single bad decision. He was part of a much bigger problem. The exposure didn't just end his career, it unraveled everything he had built. The department, desperate to save face, distanced itself from him. Officials who had once defended him were now condemning him. Politicians spoke out, using his downfall as an opportunity to push for reform. His name became synonymous with corruption, with misconduct, with the very worst of policing. His fellow officers, the ones who had once had his back, stayed silent. They knew better than to publicly support him now. He was toxic. He was finished. The investigation concluded with a clear verdict. Officer Daniels had engaged in racial profiling and misconduct. He was fired from the force. But that wasn't the end. The woman, along with her legal team, pursued further action. Civil rights lawsuits were filed. His name was dragged through courtrooms and news headlines. He became an example, a warning of what happens when power is abused and the truth is exposed. The very system that had once protected him now turned against him. And as he sat in a courtroom, facing the consequences of his actions, he finally understood. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the power of truth. And it had cost him everything. Justice is not an automatic process. It is not something that simply happens when wrongs are committed. Justice is the result of perseverance, collective effort, and the unwavering commitment of individuals who refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. When people stand together against oppression, corruption, and prejudice, they create a force that cannot be ignored. This is the essence of justice prevailing, not as an abstract ideal but as a tangible reality shaped by those who refuse to be silent. In a society where racism still lurks in the shadows, disguised in policies, practices, and systemic biases, the fight for justice is often uphill. When a black woman was wrongfully targeted by a racist cop, she stood at the intersection of power and vulnerability. He saw her as an easy target, someone he could intimidate without consequence. He had done it before. He had gotten away with it before. But this time, things were different. She knew her rights. She knew the law. And more importantly, she knew that justice was not just an abstract concept but something that had to be demanded, fought for, and defended. As the officer pulled her over, there was no legitimate reason. No broken taillight, no erratic driving, no suspicious activity. It was a stop born from prejudice, fueled by an ingrained sense of superiority that had been allowed to flourish for too long. The officer approached with authority, his posture exuding the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unchecked power. He expected fear. He expected compliance. But what he encountered was something different, a calm resolve that threw him off balance. The woman, poised and unwavering, questioned his actions. She demanded accountability in real time, refusing to be bullied into submission. She reached for her phone, knowing that the truth needed documentation. The digital age had given people a powerful weapon against injustice, the ability to record, to expose, and to bring the unseen into the public eye. And so she did. Her camera lens became a mirror reflecting the ugly reality of racial profiling, capturing every word, every action, every attempt to manipulate the situation. The officer, unprepared for resistance, became defensive. He fabricated a reason for the stop, but his words carried no weight. The woman was no ordinary civilian. She was a legal expert, someone who understood the intricacies of the system he had long abused. When she asked for his badge number, his demeanor shifted. The power dynamics he had relied on were crumbling before his eyes. The confrontation escalated, but not in the way the officer expected. He had assumed dominance, but instead, he found himself caught in a battle he was ill-equipped to fight. The woman, armed with knowledge, connections, and the support of a community that refused to let injustice go unchecked, turned the tide against him. She made a call. The voice on the other end was one of authority, influence, and unwavering commitment to justice. Within moments, backup arrived, but not for the officer. Internal affairs, civil rights attorneys, and media representatives converged on the scene, transforming what he had intended as a routine stop into a landmark case. The world watched as the footage spread like wildfire. The woman's voice, steady and clear, narrated the truth as it unfolded. Social media became a courtroom of its own, amplifying the cries for justice, ensuring that this incident would not be swept under the rug. The officer's history was laid bare. Complaints that had been ignored, patterns of misconduct that had been tolerated, all now placed under the harsh light of scrutiny. The legal system, often slow to act, found itself cornered by public demand. The people had spoken, and they would not be silenced. Investigations were launched, hearings were scheduled, and the officer, once untouchable, now faced the consequences of his actions. The department, under immense pressure, could no longer protect him. He was suspended, then fired, and soon, legal proceedings followed. But justice did not stop with his termination. The movement ignited by this incident grew beyond a single case. It became a catalyst for change, inspiring reforms in policing policies, demanding accountability at every level. People took to the streets, not just in outrage but in determination, knowing that every voice mattered, every action contributed to the greater fight against injustice. Communities came together, proving that unity was the most powerful weapon against oppression. The woman, once just a target, became a symbol of resilience and strength. She used her platform to educate, to advocate, to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had. Her courage became a rallying cry, a reminder that justice is not given but won. The officer's downfall was not just his alone. It was the collapse of a system that had protected him for too long, a system that relied on silence, on fear, on the assumption that people would not fight back. But they did. They stood together, proving that when people refuse to back down, justice is inevitable. Justice is not a passive force. It is an active pursuit, one that demands vigilance, perseverance, and an unshakable belief in what is right. The woman's stand against injustice was not just about her. It was about the countless others who had been wronged, the voices that had been silenced, the battles that had been lost. And in that moment, with the world watching, she turned the tide. Justice prevails when people stand together against injustice. It is not an individual victory but a collective triumph, a testament to the power of unity, the strength of truth, and the resilience of those who refuse to be oppressed. And as long as there are those willing to fight, to expose, to demand better, justice will always find a way to rise.